Well, thanks very much, Alan, and thanks for inviting me once again to this wonderful gathering where I feel real thinking goes on, which is quite rare, actually, and it's quite demanding sometimes, but it's very worthwhile. But I'm going to begin. My talk, by the way, is called Où sont les aromes d'antan, which you may recognize as a reference to the refrain in François Villon's ballade his ballad of the ladies of times gone by, Où sont les neiges d'antan. So, où sont les aromes d'antan? Wine as an art of ephemerality and evanescence. And I'm going to begin with a story which has nothing to do with wine. In fact, quite a lot of my talk has nothing to do with wine, but don't worry, some of it does, and very soon you'll be drinking the stuff, which is, I know, much more satisfying than hearing me talk about it. The story comes from someone who's already featured in this symposium, Giorgio Vasari, who Andrew mentioned yesterday. And I was terrified he was going to steal my story when he started talking about Vasari, and particularly Vasari's life of Michelangelo. So this comes from Vasari's life of Michelangelo. And Vasari says, Piero de' Medici, who had been left heir to his father Lorenzo, often used to send for Michelangelo, with whom he had been intimate for many years, when he wanted to buy antiques such as cameos and other engraved stones. And one winter, when a great deal of snow fell in Florence, he had Michelangelo make in his courtyard a statue of snow, which was very beautiful. Apparently this happened on the 20th of January 1494, when Michelangelo was 18. Of course, within a few days or possibly hours, it melted, and no one could remember precisely what form it had taken. No photography then. Someone might have sketched it, but we have no record of that. So I think the story of Michelangelo's snow statue or snowman challenges some of our deepest prejudices and preconceptions about art and artworks. We seem to have a prejudice against artworks which have a short life, which are ephemeral or evanescent. And I'm going to try to make a distinction between those two later. We can't take them as seriously as productions intended to last centuries or millennia. The last poem of Horace's first three books of odes, and I'm not going to apologize for using Horace quite a bit in this talk. I wrote a book about him recently, and he's, I think, a fascinating figure, the Roman poet Horace. So the last poem of the first three books of odes, which all came out together, by the way, Odes 330, begins exultantly with these words, Ex egi monumentum aere perennius. I have raised a monument more lasting than bronze. Somebody was asking what is a monument earlier, and anyway, this is something Horace says, but it's quite ironic, really, because he's saying these little poems, and they're lyric poems, and they're not very long, mostly. Looking back over his collection, he's saying these little poems are the opposite of ephemeral. They're going to last longer than the famously incorruptible metal of which sculptures, but not snow sculptures, are made. Longer than all the architectural grandiosities and vanities of the age. There's an element of boastfulness or braggadocio about what Horace is saying, but also, as I say, of irony, because how can these little utterances, just words, which are no more than breath, be longer lasting than bronze or mightier than the pyramids, which he also says they are? Definitely boasting that. I'm going to fast forward many centuries, actually, which probably you'll be happy about, because time is not on our side, I know. But don't worry, I'm very good at timekeeping, actually. Shakespeare and other love sonneteers in the Renaissance translated this aere perennius thing, which I call it the aere perennius thing, I may refer to that again, into the language of love. So here is Shakespeare Sonnet 65. Since brass, nor stone, nor earth, nor boundless sea, but sad mortality sways their power, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? Oh, how shall summer's honey breath hold out against the wreckful siege of battering days, when rocks impregnable are not so stout, nor gates of steel so strong, but time decays. O fearful meditation, where, alack, shall time's best jewel from time's chest lie hid? Or what strong hand can hold his swift foot back? Or who his spoil of beauty can forbid? O none, unless this miracle have might, that in black ink my love may still shine bright. And I suppose this is really as much about love as it is about art, or even more about love than art. I think the real worry perhaps is about the fleetingness and corruptibility of love. And art, in this case poetry, is in the service of love. It can become like amber, fixing and preserving the fleeting winged creature, otherwise doomed to die in a very short space of time. Other poets celebrating beauty and love, such as François Villon in this, the famous Ballade des Dames du Temps Jadis, with its refrain, Où sont les neiges d'antan, have a more resigned sense of their essential fleetingness. Where are the snows of yesteryear? Where are the famous beauties of the past? Melted or disintegrated, like the corpse of the dog Bendico in Lampedusa's novel The Leopard, preserved in vain by the prince's daughter, and then, in the devastating final image of the novel, falling through the air as dust. Well, you don't need to be Martin Heidegger to see that behind the Eyres perennius thing, or possibly not even behind it, lurk defiance of time and anxiety about time. Horace sums up what art, not to mention human beings, have to contend with when he speaks magnificently about the innumerable series of years and the flight of time. I can't resist saying it in Latin. I think Pasquale was speaking a few words in Latin earlier, and somehow you have to say it in Latin. So it's innumerabilis annorum series et fuga temporum, because the rhythm and meter of the Latin just capture the flight of time much better than the English. And he also puts it rather more ruefully when he addresses his wealthy friend Postumus, the funny name, ironic name, in the famous Eheu Fugaces poem, Alas, how the years slip by and there's no stopping them. Eheu Fugaces postume labuntur anni. Again, sounds better in Latin, but I won't say any more Latin. So time, for Horace, Shakespeare, Marvell, other love poets, is the great devourer. Everything goes into the jaws of time. Nothing comes out, or nothing remains, except just possibly art. So art is the only bulwark or sea defense against this devouring tide. The architectural, sculptural, literary glories of Athens are what will survive to bear witness to that culture. By the way, those architectural glories, etc., which Plato thought absolutely nothing of, to pick up Selina's point earlier today, Plato wasn't interested in the architectural glories of Athens. Makes him a bit dubious. But anyway. But even here, I'm afraid, anxiety doesn't go away. How permanent are those artworks anyway? Half of the Parthenon, which had survived pretty much intact for nearly 2,000 years, was destroyed by Venetian artillery when the temple turned into a mosque. It was being used as a munitions store by the Turks in 1687. Many ingenious, lovely things are gone that seemed sheer miracle to the multitude, as Yeats put it in his poem 1919, written in a time of great violence and destruction. But what price Palmyra, what price the Bamiyan Buddhas, what price the great souk of Aleppo? The Italian Renaissance sculptor Tullio Lombardo, born in Padua, working here in Venice, wrote that a sculpted altarpiece will be a memoria sempiterna, a sempiternal memory, unlike a painting which is cosa caduca ed instabile, a transient and unstable thing. There's a hierarchy even among artworks about which is more permanent, more time-defying. Time has the last laugh. In October 2002, Tullio Lombardo's great marble statue of Adam fell from its wooden pedestal in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and broke into 28 recognizable pieces and hundreds of small fragments. And as the Renaissance progressed, painting actually assumed a higher place in the hierarchy of the arts than sculpture. So maybe poets have the last laugh. In some ways, their works corrupt least of all and can be committed to memory. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living, as W.H. Auden put it in his elegy in memory of W.B. Yeats. But here I think we need to take a step back, or a step sideways. And this step I owe very much to a conversation with Andrew Huddleston here over a rather good bottle of Chablis, which may well have contributed to the occasion, but I think it's really more his clarity of mind that helped. Art is not just about or contained in objects, art objects. Perhaps even more importantly, it is about or resides in experience, artistic experience, or shared experience, or even its effect on the audience. Some of you may remember that Shared Experience was the name of a leading fringe theatre company in Britain in the 1980s. Rather good. Theatre with live music is the preeminent art of shared experience. A theatrical performance is a unique event, even if it is part of a long run. If you've had any experience on the other side of the footlights, you know that every performance and every audience is completely different. I know I'm speaking to at least one very distinguished actor here, so be careful what I say. But, and I've just been a very poor amateur actor, but I still say this, that you sense from the beginning of the show, this audience is sluggish, this one is alive, alert, this one is friendly, this one is hostile, etc. Actors are constantly adjusting, even improvising, even if they're speaking the same lines and following the same movements. Of course they are, because they're part of an emotional or even spiritual continuum with the audience. You can't act as if the audience wasn't there. Some classical pianists try. But how does all that fit with art's longing or need for permanence? There's nothing permanent in essence about a theatrical performance or a live concert. I say in essence because, of course, such events can now be recorded. Doesn't that change everything? Well, only up to a point, Lord Copper, I'd say. I take a very short detour into the world of Walter Benjamin and his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which I think was written in 1936. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Benjamin, who a great critic and writer in my view, argued that new media and means of reproduction had radically changed the nature of art, destroying the aura of the unique ritualistic artwork and replacing it with something much more mobile, a reproducible artwork which came to meet you halfway. And not only the nature but the purpose of art would be changed. Art would become radically politicized, aimed at changing the unfair power relations of capitalism, for instance. I suppose this is really more about uniqueness than ephemerality, but I like this idea of the artwork coming to meet you halfway, even if Benjamin's hopes for the politicization of art have still to be realized, and perhaps shouldn't be realized in some people's view. I've come a long way round, but I have finally reached the subject of wine, you may be glad to hear, but not nearly as glad as when you get a glass in your hand. All wine and art. And I'm going to suggest tentatively in the second half of this paper that it might be worth giving consideration to wine and cuisine as examples of ephemeral or evanescent art forms. Now, there are formidable obstacles here, perhaps even greater than those which faced the people in Florence in the winter of 1494, who wanted to hold on to Michelangelo's snow sculpture to give it some lasting form and credibility. I think the most obvious obstacles are connected with the fact that here we're in the realm of what have been called the lower senses of taste and smell. If there's a hierarchy of art forms, though one that changes, as we've seen, there's certainly a hierarchy of senses. Taste and smell, and perhaps touch, come below vision above all, and hearing. They are animalistic, associated with simple needs and embarrassing bodily functions. Even worse, for our purposes, they are extremely difficult to describe and almost impossible to notate and record. The vocabulary of taste and smell is notoriously limited. If you're a wine writer, you lie awake at night trying to think of a simile for minerality. If anyone has a good one, please let me know afterwards. Some wine writers have given up on all that, and they confine themselves to giving wines marks out of 100. Though, as with students these days, mysteriously no one ever scores less than 80. But just think how exciting art criticism would be if it confined itself to giving paintings marks out of 100. Actually, I'm not sure it's right to say that wine is ephemeral. Once you open a bottle, to be sure, it is pretty ephemeral. It will probably be consumed within hours, at most a couple of days. But that bottle may have rested undisturbed in a cellar for decades. Wine ages. Ageability is what gives certain wines, fine Bordeaux, vintage port, special status and collectability. But those words slip easily off the tongue, wine ages, but just think what they mean. What other artwork or object of aesthetic appreciation? And that's my cunning way of sidestepping the perhaps unnecessary debate about whether wine can be a work of art. What artwork or object of aesthetic appreciation can be said to age? That is, to mature, to improve with age, ultimately to perish. And by the way, I could say more about the fact that wine is also connected to nature in a very particular way, to the weather of particular years. So all of those terms are not usually applied to paintings, sculptures, musical masterpieces, dramas, etc. Those are perfect at the moment of completion and can at best only hold that perfection. Perhaps certain buildings acquire an attractive patina with age. Dramas and musical masterpieces and poems are, to be sure, constantly being reinterpreted. We're very much looking forward to hearing one such reinterpretation very soon from Geoffrey, the Chopin Preludes. And so, in a way, they're being refreshed all the time. And then there are works such as Beethoven's late quartets, which are only properly appreciated decades or even centuries after they were composed, as Beethoven himself predicted. But even that doesn't mean that they mature with age or just age. We age, unfortunately. We lose our smoothness of skin, our elasticity, our mobility, eventually our faculties. No pious observance or ritual can put paid to wrinkles, as Horace said in his ode to Posthumus, who hoped that his wealth and his religious piety might stave off the depredations of time. And of course, I must add here that Horace was writing before the time of Botox, let alone the time of Kurzweil and the singularity. So these are the brute facts that make us run to art, to something that will defy time, that will preserve some part of us, our love maybe, in immortal amber or aspic. Non omnis moriar, cries Horace, not all of me will die. Sorry, I said I wasn't going to read any more Latin, but I couldn't resist it. It's great that. Non omnis moriar. Wine, in fact, is embarrassingly like us. The lifespan of a fine wine can be almost exactly that of a human being, although not of one destined to live hundreds or thousands of years, I must say, but a human being as currently conceived, with a lifespan not that far off the biblical one. It shares our frailty, our fluidity, maybe also our transient glory. That frailty and fluidity are what we have tried to defy and counter with our immortal works of art. But what if we were to allow ourselves to draw closer to, consider more seriously, artworks or objects of aesthetic appreciation which embrace time and time's passing instead of defying it? Now I'm going to suggest a distinction between ephemerality and evanescence. Ephemeral means for the day, two Greek words, ephemera, and a daily newspaper, I was thinking, could be considered a classic ephemeral phenomenon. It will not last for more than a day usually, but for that day it can have quite a robust presence. But actually I wrote that before listening to Luciano's talk this morning, and this very worrying idea of the perpetual front page. And in fact, actually, as I kind of know from my own profession, the fact that daily newspapers may be ephemeral in more than one sense, how much longer will they last at all? Anyway, that was what I meant when I wrote it. But evanescence goes further, I think. It implies that the experience of something includes the sense of its fleetingness, that it is literally or metaphorically constantly in the act of slipping from one's grasp. Possibly rather like Venice itself as painted by Turner, as Andrew was mentioning yesterday. So wine might be a classic case of this. Our neglected senses of taste and smell are intrinsically connected with evanescence. It is much harder to grasp and retain an image of what we taste and smell as compared to one of what we see or hear. As we sniff the bouquet of a wine, we're on the trail of something subtle and elusive, almost impossible to pin down. We might feel we have a firmer grasp with taste, but that too lasts a very short time and is constantly changing, as the wine meets different parts of our sensory apparatus and is itself changed by the passing of time and contact with the air. But what tastes and smells lack in terms of clear definition, they may gain an evocative power. Smells and tastes may not represent anything, but they certainly evoke feelings and memories. After all, was it not the taste of a Madeleine cake dipped in either tea or coffee? I've heard both versions in this symposium, so I don't know which it was now. But anyway, the Madeleine cake, which opened the door to the treasure house of memory, which became Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu. With an evanescent art form, like a theatrical or musical performance, a snow sculpture, a wine, or a great culinary experience, if we admit those into the realm of art, memory is clearly going to be of a special importance. My sense is that the question of mechanical recording or reproduction, which I mentioned earlier, may be essentially a red herring. Although this is a very interesting, I think, sort of thought experiment. Again, I owe this to Andrew. If there was a device which could precisely record the experience you had tasting or drinking a wine, I suppose so that it could be repeated indefinitely, what difference would that make? Well, my hunch is that it would be a distraction from and a denaturing of the experience, but happy to discuss that. Wine and food are enjoyed in intimate settings on the whole. There are, of course, such things as grand public feasts, but those are not usually the most satisfying gastronomic experiences. Wine and food are enjoyed and shared with friends, and they are, in fact, a medium of friendship. Horace, I think, once again, got to the heart of the matter in a series of odes on the subject of wine. And this is my very free translation of Horace's greatest wine ode, Odes 3:21. Your time is up, my faithful aged Margot, contemporary, my twin. Just think of it, you were vintaged the year of Supermax, shameless spin, that you've never had it so good, Guff. Oh come, descend. Old friend Jim has called for smoother stuff. Heaven knows what havoc or ferment, what vehement argument or crazy love obsession or merciful slumping into snores you have in store. Though philosophically inclined and aptest to peruse abstruser tomes by Plato, I know my friend will not refuse a little tipple of the warming kind, not scorned by stern old Cato. He was a very puritanical old Roman moralist, by the way. In vino veritas, they say, you, venerable vintage, have the subtle knack of mellowing tough nuts. Such a dusty bottle can unlock from the most crusty the best-kept secret and release the crack. And that's not all. You can restore to a desperate mind the balm of hope, give strength and sustenance to the poor man faced with all the aftermath of war. One wee dram and he'll feel potent as a pope. Your presence brings diviner traces, goatee Bacchus and the gorgeous Venus, if she's willing, and the gang of graces, so slow to untie their virgins' girdles, all dance around us while we drink till dawn, which I think may have been happening the last couple of nights, although I wasn't present, but I heard something about it anyway. This ode, I'm near the end now, so don't despair. The wine itself will soon be flowing. This ode sums up everything Horace thought was important about wine, which means most of what he thought was important about life and art, I think. First, friendship. This ode is addressed to his old comrade at arms from the battlefield of Philippi, where Horace fought on the losing side, the side of Brutus and Cassius. His old comrade at arms, Marcus Valerius Messala Corvinus. Friendship is about differences as well as similarities and closenesses. And Messala Corvinus was a very different character from Horace, one senses, crusty and difficult, where Horace was warm and voluble. This leads on to the second thing, philosophy. Wine is a philosophical thing, as Roger has beautifully written about. He's written a whole book about that, by the way, as well as a sensuous, even a riotous one. That is to say, wine helps us to live well, however strange that notion might seem. Third, divinity. Wine is a commerce with the divine. This may seem even more far-fetched, but this is what Horace is saying in the final stanza of the poem. Wine, the right wine, and we will see this is no ordinary wine he's talking about here, takes us beyond ourselves to magical places. Wine, as the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset recognized, is not just vino, something you glug in a bar, but vino divino, something which transports you to another realm. Which brings us to the fourth thing, mortality. Perhaps the most important and moving words in the poem are the first three. Oh gosh, more Latin, sorry, I'd forgotten that. O nata mecum, O born with me. It's how he's addressing this jar of wine. It's a special jar of Massic, which is one of the top Roman wines, and it was vintaged the year Horace was born, the year of Consul Manlius, 65 BC. So it was over 40 years old when he broached it. Wine is born with us and dies with us. It is not Eyres perennius, more lasting than bronze, as the poetry will prove to be. No, wine is not Eyres perennius, far from it, but it leaves warm memories, traces in the heart. It can even change people. It is, of course, a kind of drug. And this is the message of Isak Dinason's great fable, Babette's Feast. You may know her better as Karen Blixen, which was her real name, but she wrote under the pen name of Isak Dinasson. Babette's Feast, which you probably know, maybe from the very good film, but the short story is wonderful, is the tale of an émigré French chef, Babette, marooned in a community of gloomy Scandinavian religious fanatics. Babette has been working as an unpaid cook for 14 years for these two sisters, once very beautiful, never married, the daughters of the founder of a stern religious sect. Then one day she wins the lottery, and she decides to give a feast up to the highest Parisian standards, the standards that she kept to in her famous restaurant in Paris, for these puritanical Scandinavian burghers. They don't really know what she's up to as crates full of delicacies arrive, and they don't know what they're eating and drinking when the feast takes place, all except one character, a general who was once engaged to one of the sisters. But as the turtle soup is succeeded by the caille en sarcophage, or entombed quails, and the fine amontillado gives way to the Veuve Clicquot 1860, they sense something has happened, something has changed. Old grudges and enmities magically dissolve. Old loves revive. People have been made human again. And only an artist could have made that happen. In this case, the artist-chef Babette, who makes a heart-changing wonder out of the mortal, the perishable, the evanescent. Unfortunately, Babette turns out to have blown all her winnings on the feast. The sisters are completely amazed. They had no idea a feast could cost that much. But I am an artist, she says, and an artist is never poor. One of the sisters, Philippa, says to console her, "In paradise, you will be the great artist God meant you to be." Maybe she still hadn't got the point.